From 1952 through early 1957, the southern Great Plains experienced what meteorologists would later calculate as a once-in-140-year drought event. Across Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and neighboring states, rainfall stations recorded below normal precipitation for 40 to 60 consecutive months. In some parts of Texas and Arizona, rainfall fell below normal more than 80% of the time during this 5-year stretch. The numbers were staggering. This wasn't just bad luck with weather. This was a drought with a recurrence interval exceeding 50 years across much of Texas and reaching 140 years in the broader southern plains. Here's what makes this drought remarkable. It actually affected a larger geographical area than the famous Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Yet you've probably never heard of it. There were no iconic photographs of buried tractors, no mass migrations of desperate families heading west, no congressional hearings about agricultural catastrophe. The 1950s drought should have been worse than the Dust Bowl, but it wasn't. 3 things had changed in the 20 years between these droughts. First, farmers were pulling groundwater from the Ogallala Aquifer through thousands of new wells, irrigating fields that would have died in the 1930s. Second, soil conservation districts coordinated land management across 38 districts in the southern plains alone, preventing the erosion that created black blizzards 2 decades earlier. Third, federal farm programs provided economic stability without the accompanying Great Depression that had devastated 1930s farm families. So how did farmers actually live through 5 years without normal rainfall? How did they eat, sleep, work, and survive when the sky refused to cooperate? Drop a comment below telling us what surprises you most about this forgotten drought, because the daily reality was more complex than you'd think. The diesel pump, sitting at the edge of your wheat field in 1953, could pull 500 gallons of water per minute from 150 feet underground. That single piece of equipment represented the difference between harvest and total crop failure. By the early 1950s, thousands of these pumps were drawing water from the Ogallala Aquifer, a massive underground reservoir stretching beneath 8 states from South Dakota to Texas. This aquifer held water that had accumulated over thousands of years, and it was about to become the lifeline that kept Great Plains agriculture alive. The irrigation revolution had started after the Dust Bowl, but it accelerated dramatically through the 1940s and into the 1950s. Farmers who remembered watching their crops shrivel and die in the 1930s weren't going to let it happen again. By the time the 1950s drought hit, somewhere between 30 and 46% of irrigated land in some Great Plains states was being watered from groundwater wells. In the 1930s, this infrastructure simply didn't exist. Most farmers had relied entirely on rainfall, and when the rain stopped, everything stopped. Drilling a well in the early 1950s cost serious money. You were looking at several $1,000s to punch down 150 to 200 feet through rock and soil, install casing, and set up a pump system. For context, that was equivalent to buying a new tractor, or more than many farmers made in a year. But farmers who made that investment could keep crops growing when their neighbors' fields turned brown. The diesel engines that powered these pumps became as familiar as the sound of wind across the plains. They ran for hours each day during irrigation season, their steady rhythm marking time in a landscape where rain had become unreliable. Operating these systems meant daily work. You checked oil levels, monitored fuel consumption, watched for mechanical problems, and calculated how many hours you could afford to run the pump based on your diesel supply and your crop's water needs. At night, some farmers set alarms to check on pumps, making sure water was flowing and equipment hadn't failed. A breakdown during a critical growth period could mean losing a field. Here's what surprised everyone during the drought. When rain finally did fall, it helped the crops but barely touched the aquifer. The soil had become so depleted of moisture that it absorbed rainfall before water could percolate down to recharge the underground reservoir. Even moderate storms that would normally contribute to groundwater levels simply disappeared into the parched earth. Farmers were essentially mining water from ancient reserves, drawing down an account that wasn't being replenished. The pumps kept running, the crops kept growing, but the water table kept dropping. This was survival, but it came with a cost that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. By 1941, 38 soil conservation districts had been established across the southern Great Plains. These weren't just government offices pushing paperwork. They were coordinated networks of farmers who had watched their topsoil blow away in the 1930s and decided it would never happen again. When the 1950s drought arrived with its 40 to 60 months of below normal rainfall, these districts became the organizational backbone that kept the land intact. Each district coordinated land management practices across thousands of acres. They shared equipment that individual farmers couldn't afford alone. They enforced practices that protected everyone's land because erosion didn't respect property lines. If your neighbor's field started blowing, the dust ended up on your crops. The districts made conservation a collective effort rather than individual gambles. The techniques themselves had been learned through hard experience. Contour plowing followed the natural curves of the land rather than running straight up and down slopes, slowing water runoff and reducing erosion. Farmers planted grass strips between crop fields, creating barriers that caught soil before it could blow away. Most importantly, they maintained the cropland to grassland ratios that had existed around 1920 before the plow-up frenzy that preceded the Dust Bowl. This meant accepting that some land should stay in grass permanently, even when wheat prices tempted expansion. Here's the stunning result. Despite experiencing subnormal rainfall for longer than the Dust Bowl period, the 1950s drought produced no widespread dust storms. The black blizzards that had darkened skies from Texas to Washington, D.C. in the 1930s simply didn't happen. Farmers were living through a more severe meteorological drought, yet their fields stayed put. Daily farming routines now included conservation as standard practice. You didn't just decide which field to plant. You checked your contour lines, maintained your grass strips, and coordinated with your district about which marginal lands should stay fallow. This was extra labor, extra planning, and sometimes extra cost. But it was also insurance that paid off every day the wind blew across dry fields that no longer turned into dust clouds. The farmers who managed best were often those who had been on the land since before 1920. They remembered what sustainable land use looked like before the expansion years. The newcomers who'd arrived in the 1920s, drawn by high wheat prices and promises of easy money, had often pushed land too hard. By the 1950s, the survivors had learned or left. The drought created a self-perpetuating cycle that conservation helped break. Depleted soil moisture meant less evaporation, which meant less moisture returning to the atmosphere, which intensified dry conditions. But maintained grass cover and proper land management kept some moisture in the soil system. It wasn't enough to end the drought, but it was enough to prevent the complete ecological collapse that had defined the previous decade's disaster. The land was holding, and that made all the difference. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button. Most viewers watch without subscribing, but it really helps us create more content about modern agriculture and agricultural history. We've got more stories about how farmers adapted to impossible conditions, and your subscription makes that possible. During the Dust Bowl, 21% of rural families in the Great Plains required federal relief just to survive. In the 1950s drought, despite facing meteorologically worse conditions across a larger area, that number dropped to a fraction of the earlier crisis. The difference wasn't the weather, it was everything else. The federal farm programs created during the 1930s were renewed when the 1950s drought hit, but this time they operated in a completely different economic environment. There was no Great Depression crushing commodity prices. Banks weren't failing. The broader economy was growing, not collapsing. Wheat prices remained stable enough that farmers who could produce a crop could actually make money from it. In the 1930s, farmers had watched prices crater even before the drought hit. By 1932, wheat that had sold for over $1 a bushel in the 1920s was bringing 38 cents. You could grow a crop and still go bankrupt. The 1950s were different. Prices fluctuated, but they stayed within a range where farming remained economically viable. This stability changed everything about daily economic decisions. a farmer with irrigation could calculate whether running the diesel pump for another 6 hours was worth the fuel cost against the expected yield increase. You could make rational business decisions instead of just fighting for survival. If wheat looked marginal, you could shift to sorghum or another drought-tolerant crop and still expect a reasonable return. The math actually worked. Farm budgets during these years balanced on multiple income sources. Crop sales provided the primary income, but many families maintained small livestock operations that could be sustained with irrigated feed crops. Some farmers took off-season work in nearby towns, something that was easier in the 1950s economy than during the Depression. Federal programs provided price supports and conservation payments that helped cover the costs of maintaining grass strips and following soil conservation practices. It wasn't prosperity, but it was solvency. The irrigation investment paid for itself in ways that went beyond just keeping crops alive. A farmer with a working well could produce 30 to 40 bushels of wheat per acre even in drought years, while dryland fields might produce nothing. That production meant income, which meant you could make your mortgage payment, buy fuel and seed for next year, and keep your family fed. Banks that had foreclosed on thousands of farms in the 1930s were now willing to finance well drilling because irrigated land had proven value even in drought. Here's what the numbers showed. The 1950s drought covered more territory and lasted longer than the Dust Bowl, yet it caused far less agricultural damage. Crop failures were localized rather than regional. Farm bankruptcies happened, but didn't cascade into systemic collapse. People stayed on their land because staying made economic sense. Every spring brought the same calculations. What could you afford to plant? How much irrigation water did you have access to? What were prices looking like? Should you expand into that marginal quarter section or keep it in grass? These decisions happened around kitchen tables, in conversations with neighbors, in meetings at the Conservation District office. Farming had become more complex, requiring more capital and more technical knowledge, but it had also become more resilient. The combination of technology, stable markets, and coordinated land management created economic viability that simply hadn't existed 20 years earlier. Farmers were making it work, day by day, season by season, through 5 years when the sky offered little help. The alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, same as it had for the past 3 years of drought. Before breakfast, before coffee, you pulled on boots and walked out to check the pump. In summer, you wanted to irrigate during the cooler hours before the sun turned water into vapor faster than it could soak into the ground. You listened to the diesel engine's rhythm, checked the fuel level, made sure water was flowing through the lines. This 20-minute walk happened every morning, and some nights you'd wake at 2 a.m. just to verify everything was still running. The physical environment wore on you in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. The heat was relentless during summer months, regularly pushing past 100 degrees with no rain to break the pattern. There was dust, though nothing like the 1930s storms. It was a fine grit that worked into everything: your clothes, your food, the sheets on your bed. You'd wipe down the kitchen table before every meal. The air felt dry enough to crack your skin. And you learned to move slower during the hottest parts of the day because the heat could drop you if you pushed too hard. Water management became a household obsession. Every drop mattered. The well that irrigated your fields also supplied your house, and you watched those water levels like they were a bank account, because essentially they were. Baths became shorter. Laundry happened less frequently. You caught rainwater when it did fall, even a quarter-inch shower, storing it in barrels for the garden or chickens. Women developed systems for reusing wash water, first for clothes, then for floors, finally for the outdoor plants closest to the house. Nothing went to waste. Meals required planning that went beyond normal farm cooking. The kitchen garden survived only with regular irrigation, so you calculated which vegetables were worth the water investment. Tomatoes, beans, and squash made the cut. Lettuce didn't, too much water for too little nutrition. Many families expanded their chicken flocks because chickens converted kitchen scraps and a bit of grain into eggs and meat efficiently. Livestock management shifted toward animals that could handle heat and limited forage. Some farmers reduced their cattle herds, keeping only the most productive animals and supplementing their feed with irrigated hay or sorghum. Community networks became essential for both practical support and psychological survival. Neighbors shared information about which wells were holding up, which seed varieties were performing better, where you could find diesel fuel at a decent price. Church gatherings and town meetings weren't just social events. They were intelligence exchanges where farmers pooled knowledge about surviving conditions none of them had experienced before. When someone's pump broke down, neighbors helped with repairs or shared irrigation time. You helped others knowing you'd need help yourself eventually. Sleep came hard during those years. The heat made nights uncomfortable, even with windows open and fans running. But beyond physical discomfort was the mental weight of watching the sky month after month, seeing clouds that produced nothing or scattered showers that barely settled the dust. You'd lie awake calculating, how many more weeks could you irrigate at current rates? What if the well level dropped another 5 feet? Could you make it to harvest? Some farmers set alarms to check pumps during the night, breaking sleep into fragments. Others just woke naturally, their subconscious refusing to rest while expensive equipment ran in the dark. The psychological toll of 40 to 60 consecutive months of below normal rainfall was real, even if farmers didn't talk about it much. Every morning, you scanned the horizon for clouds. Every weather report got your full attention. You found yourself making deals with the sky, with God, with fate. Just give us a good rain. Just let this crop make it. The stress showed in shorter tempers, in worry lines that deepened in the way conversations kept circling back to the same topic. When would it end? But here's what kept families going. Visible proof that this wasn't the 1930s. Your irrigated fields were growing crops while rain-dependent fields stayed brown. But you were growing something. Prices stayed stable enough to make that production worthwhile. Most importantly, your neighbors weren't leaving. There were no caravans of trucks heading west, no abandoned houses with doors banging in the wind. The community was holding together. Kids still went to school. The grain elevator still operated. The bank stayed open. These ordinary continuities became extraordinary sources of hope. Families developed small rituals of resilience. Some kept rain gauges and recorded every hundredth of an inch that fell, maintaining hope through measurement. Others focused on the improvements they could see, the grass strips holding soil in place, the conservation terraces working as designed, the irrigation systems proving their worth. You celebrated small victories, a better than expected yield, a well that held steady, a neighbor's success with a new technique you could try next season. The daily challenges demanded constant problem solving. When dust clogged irrigation lines, you learned to install better filters. When heat stressed your crops despite watering, you adjusted timing and amounts. When fuel costs cut into margins, you coordinated with neighbors to buy diesel in bulk. Every problem had to have a solution because giving up wasn't an option. You'd invested too much, learned too much, and come too far to quit when the technology and knowledge to survive actually existed. By the 5th year, the routines had become almost automatic. Check the pump, manage the water, work the fields, watch the sky, help your neighbors, plan for next season. You were tired in ways that went bone deep, but you were still there, still farming, still making it work. That persistence, multiplied across thousands of farm families, was proving something important, that farmers had learned from disaster and transformed their relationship with this difficult land. The drought would eventually end, but what you'd learned about survival would last much longer. In 1952, when the rain stopped falling across the southern Great Plains, farmers faced a test that should have broken them. For 5 years, through 40 to 60 consecutive months of below normal rainfall, they lived with a meteorological event that statisticians would calculate as occurring once every 140 years. This drought covered more territory than the Dust Bowl and lasted just as long. By every measure, it should have produced the same catastrophic results. It didn't. And that difference tells you everything about what farmers had learned in the 20 years between these droughts. 3 pillars kept agriculture alive when the sky refused to cooperate. Groundwater irrigation, pulled ancient water from the Ogallala Aquifer through thousands of wells that hadn't existed in the 1930s. Soil conservation districts coordinated land management across 38 districts in the Southern Plains alone, preventing the erosion that had created black blizzards 2 decades earlier. Economic stability through federal programs and stable commodity prices meant farmers could make rational business decisions instead of just fighting for survival. Together, these changes transformed a potential catastrophe into a manageable crisis. The contrast in outcomes is staggering. In the 1930s, 21% of rural Great Plains families needed federal relief. In the 1950s, facing worse meteorological conditions across a larger area, that number dropped to a fraction of the earlier crisis. There were no mass migrations, no widespread bank failures, no congressional hearings about agricultural collapse. Farmers stayed because staying made sense. This was a human achievement as much as a technological one. Farmers who had watched their land blow away in the 1930s refused to let it happen again. They invested in expensive wells knowing they might face another drought. They followed conservation practices that required extra labor and reduced short-term profits. They coordinated with neighbors and accepted that some land should stay in grass permanently. They learned, adapted, and persisted through 5 years that tested every lesson they'd absorbed from the previous disaster. But the victory came with costs that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. Those diesel pumps running day and night were drawing down an aquifer that had taken thousands of years to fill. Groundwater levels dropped during the drought and never fully recovered. The irrigation that saved 1950s agriculture set up long-term challenges that farmers are still grappling with today. The Ogallala Aquifer is now depleting faster than it recharges, a direct consequence of the survival strategies that worked so well in the 1950s. Still, what the 1950s drought proved matters. It demonstrated that farmers could learn from catastrophe and transform their practices in ways that fundamentally changed their resilience. It showed that technology, organization, and policy could work together to prevent disaster even when nature delivered its worst. It proved that the Great Plains could be farmed sustainably if farmers respected the land's limits and worked collectively rather than individually. The farmers who survived those 5 years without normal rainfall earned something beyond economic survival. They earned proof that adaptation was possible, that lessons learned in crisis could prevent the next catastrophe, and that human determination combined with smart practices could overcome conditions that once seemed unsurvivable. If this opened your eyes to how farmers survived one of the most severe droughts in American history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about agricultural resilience and innovation. Drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most about the 1950s drought and how farmers made it through 5 years without rain. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.